I've been postponing this tutorial for quite some time because I thought this little technique is so simple that it's not even worth mentioning. But then I've got a question from Nicole in one of the comments on YouTube. She asked whether I have a tutorial about fixing big stitches. And that's when I realized that even though this little trick is quite straightforward, it might not be obvious to everyone. So with big thanks to Nicole for bringing up this issue, let's take a look at arguably the easiest knitting technique out there. When I say big stitches, I don't mean stitches that are the result of a knitting mistake. I mean stitches that got enlarged for some reason, like these stitches. Either when we got distracted and our attention got uneven, or when something actually caught on the fabric and pulled the stitch out, making it bigger. And that's actually exactly what I did over here to make these big stitches. I simply pulled on the stitch. So there are no knitting mistakes involved. And before we start fixing these stitches, let's remind ourselves that every row or round of the knitted fabric is a wave. So the yarn is formed this way, and we can clearly see it when we look at this swatch, where one row of thick yarn shows that the yarn is forming a wave. And when we have this concept in mind, we understand that when one of the stitches gets bigger, we can easily fix it by redistributing the yarn between the adjacent stitches. And that's exactly what we're gonna do in this tutorial. And for that reason, we will use the wool needle. And we will use the blunt side of the wool needle because we don't want to split the yarn. So if we have one stitch, most often it's just one stitch. If we have a situation like this in our knitting, here's what we do. First, we pull the left leg of the stitch that is at the right side of the big stitch. So we are looking at the next leg basically that is close to that stitch. So we go under that leg, and it's a good idea, like I said, to use the blunt side of the needle because we don't want to go inside the yarn. We want to simply pull this leg and pull it a bit to make this big stitch a bit smaller. And then we do the same thing but on the other side of the big stitch. So we go under the right leg of the stitch at the left side, get that leg and pull it a bit to make the stitch as big as the rest of the stitches. So as you see, now all stitches are pretty much the same. So if we have a situation like this one over here, when we have a cluster of stitches, we do pretty much the same thing, but we start with the stitch at the center. So we start with this little guy. And we pull one leg of the stitch at the left side, making this big stitch smaller. And then we do the same thing over here until this stitch, the central stitch, is of the right side. So until it is as big as the rest of the stitches of the fabric. So now we have the central stitch fixed, and we have just two stitches at each side of that stitch to fix. First of all, because this stitch has one leg of this stitch is bigger than the other leg, so we go under both legs of the stitch and kind of even it out. And then we pull this leg, and then we find the leg that is next to it and pull that stitch, making this stitch smaller. And then we kind of keep going, kind of like ripples. We are moving from the center, rearranging the stitches, pulling the right or leg stitch of the stitches that are nearby. So we keep going until all stitches are about the same size. So here we go. We fixed these stitches to look about the same as the rest of the stitches, and it's okay if they don't look perfect yet, because we're gonna do one more thing to improve the look of the fabric. And we're gonna do the same thing that we usually do when we block the fabric. So we simply pull really hard sideways like this, and if you see that, for example, this leg is quite stubborn, it doesn't want to get to become the same size. So it also helps to kind of pull the strands like this, like every stitch, pull them sideways. And then once you redistribute the yarn, you pull the fabric between the cast on and bind off edges like this, evening out the tension and making all stitches of about the same size. So that's the easy fix, and we can use exactly the same idea when we fix stitches, the bigger stitches that usually accompany the slip stitch edging that is formed when we slip the fourth stitch and purl the last stitch of every row. So usually this edging has those big stitches right next to it. So we simply take the wool needle and pull the right leg of the slipped stitch like this. See, this stitch used to be big, now it's not big anymore. And then we do it to this stitch, for example. We simply pull the right leg and keep going. And then once we fix these stitches, then we pull the selvage stitches to make them of the same size, so that both legs of the stitches are the same. And we do the same thing. See, this needle, it wants to run from me. We do the same thing over here, fixing the big stitches at this side of the work. Again, we are pulling the right leg of the selvage stitch. And then rearrange the selvage stitches themselves to make sure that both legs of the selvage stitch are of the same size. And here we go, simple trick that fixes loose stitches. Now you are well armed to tackle all kinds of loose stitches in your knitting, and that means that from now on your projects will look impeccable, even though they did have a few uneven stitches at some point. No one will ever know about that. To read this tutorial as a set of step-by-step photo instructions, follow the link in the description. To download it as a PDF, join the club or our community on Patreon. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you in the next tutorial.